After reading How to Read Literature Like a Professor over the summer, I decided to apply the knowledge I have learned from Thomas C. Foster to Brave New World. And of course, I've already read Brave New World in the previous, sophomore year, and just decided to dive right back into it. So right off the bat, starting off Brave New World for a second time, instantly it opens up in the Hatching and Conditioning Center in London, right? And the Hatching and Conditioning Center is used to produce the human beings and condition the humans for their predestined roles in the world state. And pretty much human beings are no longer producing living offspring. Now it's just surgically removed ovaries that are fertilized, and they're artificially made, and they're kept in incubated bottles, and it's man-made. And right away, this reminded me of chapter 21 in How to Read Literature Like a Professor, Marked for Greatness. And this is where Foster writes of Frankenstein and uses Frankenstein as an example in order to show how people are in fear of the way technology is changing the human existence, and how humans now have the power to or they will have the power to manipulate image and even predestined roles. And here Foster explains that there's just a fear from people shifting from religion to technology and science now. So pretty much, as time's changing, people are changing from religion to science. Thus, it's disrupting the laws of nature, as Foster explains, and people are playing the role of God when they are in fact not God. And they're doing this by creating man-made life. Foster also explains within this chapter how important it is and how powerful it is to have the ability to be able to make these thematic connections based on how similar our society is to the ones before us, that came before us. So pretty much Frankenstein was written in 1818. It's a work of fiction, and it possesses and writes on the fears of technology impacting the human existence, as I explained previously. Well, Brave New World, written in 1932, a completely different time era, is also written as going based off those fears of technology affecting the human existence. And of course, Brave New World is a dystopian novel of science fiction, and both works of fiction, but they both are based on the same theme, despite the time difference. Another very seemingly prevalent topic within Brave New World talks about just anything related to sexual activities throughout the book, because the book it can have very high focus on sex, considering the fact that that sex is not used for producing offspring anymore. Now it's used for more of means of pleasure. So chapter 16, Foster writes, it's all about sex. And this explains that sex is just so important because it's one of those fundamental aspects of the human experience. It's so significant because it's one of the only things that people still do today in the same way it was done however many years ago. It stays the same. And sexual symbolism has been around in literature as long as literature has existed itself. So Foster continues to explain that our social and moral views of sex change, and that affects the sexual symbolism. So as current day, as time progresses, sex isn't what it used to be. Sex used to be an act of love, and I'm not saying it's not anymore, but it's a rare case that you hear those cases of people that are not only having casual sex, they're having sex with someone they are deeply in love with, or they waited for marriage, and that's becoming a less and lesser case as time progresses. And as a dystopian novel, Brave New World seems to call out that that's going to happen sooner or later, to the extent of it meaning nothing. Because Foster writes of examples where sex is had out of chivalry and romance, but we have Huxley, who's writing about sex in terms of just pleasure with no relationship. He takes the relationship away completely, where sex is just sex. And pretty much it's just our social and moral views of sex are still ever changing. So within Brave New World, they're changing, and within the real world, they're changing. Instantly, when I was reading How to Read Literature Like a Professor, and I got to chapter 5, when in doubt, it's from Shakespeare, my brain went straight to Brave New World because of just how evident the work of Shakespeare is within the novel because John the Savage. So John the Savage pretty much sees the world from Shakespeare's perspective. He has a book of Shakespeare's work, pretty much. And he uses this to actually show that someone can feel emotion. Because John the Savage he lived on the reserve, so he's not from the world state. He doesn't have that emotionless aspect of himself that everyone else does. And Shakespeare, in a way, helps him remind him that you can feel. There can be words that actually have emotion behind them. It doesn't just need to be this propaganda world state words that mean pretty much nothing. So pretty much chapter 5, Foster just writes about how it's almost impossible to avoid the works of Shakespeare. It's everywhere in literature. It's everywhere in our society. And I even found that within Brave New World, just out of a whole character. Another thing that really stood out to me while reading How to Read Literature Like a Professor was when I read chapter 14, Yes, She's a Christ Figure Too. And this is where Foster describes the figure of Jesus and how this figure has developed a life of its own in literature, and Foster goes on to describe that the archetype of Jesus now involves historical facts and personal qualities of Jesus himself. And the literary characters that do possess these qualities that Jesus does, they can qualify as Christ figures. So in Brave New World, the citizens replace any word that Lord would have been in with Ford, Henry Ford. And this chapter, Foster writes about how you need historical context in order to understand what you're reading and help better interpret. And say one didn't know who Henry Ford was, one didn't know his works of the assembly line, who didn't know what he did, that he was from the early 20th century and founder of the Ford Motor Company. This historical context just helps better interpret for purposes of interpreting. And without the biblical context, too, the reader wouldn't be able to pick up on the phrases that do contain Lord that now contain Ford. So pretty much here, I just figured out how Ford is literally praised upon within this book. And I can know that because of the historical and biblical context that I do know. Chapter 11 of How to Read Literature Like a Professor, More Than It's Gonna Hurt You, Concerning Violence, talks about how sometimes literature is there just to make sense of the cruel world that we live in, and it's there to kind of take that, it's like a way to escape for a second. You're reading about something that's happy and something that's more optimistic and idealistic than our real world. There's no realism within it. But once you put the book down, you have to go back to that cruelty. Foster also writes, however, that sometimes literature rather reinforces this cruelty. And that's what Brave New World does. It takes a turn of reinforcing the cruel world that we live in. And that's more because of the utopia turning into a dystopia, how it usually goes. But pretty much, this book is filled with acts of cruelty and just suppression of feelings and being sad, and it's honestly it's sad to see. It's sad to read about because people are physically pushing down their feelings. So Foster writes about how every act of violence is a struggle between two forces. This can even be violence against themselves, like self-harm and suicide. John the Savage actually results in killing himself at the end of the novel. And that just shows the violence acting upon himself, the cruelty acting upon him as a person. And it's just the reasons for himself to commit suicide because it was his choice. And he had a choice. And it was rare for those in world state to make a choice. But John from the reserve, the outsider, was able to make that choice. And that was very important while reading the book, knowing that this act of violence was inflicted on himself. But it was because the author was just reinforcing the cruelty of the world. Chapter 23, It's Never Just Heart Disease, talks about how heart disease symbolizes suffering of illness, cruelty, cowardice, and it also talks about how many associate the heart with love, because, you think of love, you think of your heart, you think of a broken heart, you think of falling out of love. It's just a key association. Pretty much, it also talks about how illness is a way to progress the plot, and illness was a way of mystery, and it can be symbolic for those going against or doing something bad or negative. Grow ill, they grow old, stuff like that, as Foster explains. And in the book Brave New World, these lives they're artificially made. So there's internal secretions that are artificially balanced so they maintain their youthful equilibrium. And they get blood transfusions, and their metabolism is permanently stimulated. And they also get mineral levels to maintain their youth as well. So pretty much, as long as you're in this community and you can have stability and you can identify with the world state, then you remain healthy, you don't grow old, you remain thin, all of these things. You can't get heart disease being symbolic for illness, of course. But those who live on the reserve, John's mom, she grows old and dies of age. And because she's not protected by the world state, she can grow old. She's not getting these transfusions and stuff like that. So that's just showing that I think that was symbolic for going against, not even going against, but not being a part of the world state could be the reason of death. And that's why people definitely do choose to follow with the world state, because, they want to be insiders, not outsiders. And if it's people on the reserve are dying and people in world state aren't dying, which one are people going to choose? That's at least how I took it. In Chapter 17, a follow-up to Chapter 16, it's all about sex, but Chapter 17 is talking about how it's all about sex, except sex. In this chapter, Foster explains how it's hard for authors to actually depict the actual sex part because of the awkwardness in doing so. And I can see how in Brave New World, they have to actually induce soma in order to take away that awkwardness, because sex is not the most comfortable thing in the world in regards to how people feel and, just inner emotions like that. But these people are actually having to, in order to relax and cut loose, they're having to abuse substance to do so. And I think it's really cool how Huxley just captures that and takes away the awkwardness, but also by taking it away, showing that there is that initial sense of awkwardness. Chapter 13, It's All Political, talks about how there is historical context needed to form a political opinion. You need to know what's going on in the real world around this time era to actually fully form the political standpoint on the book and on the author, as Foster also explains. But pretty much during this time period, 1932, when the book was written, the stock market is crashing, Great Depression timing. There's been warning against letting technology advance too far, and this is a dystopian novel, so pretty much it also is a warning of what's to come, and technology was on the come up at this time. And there's also communism, and this is also shown within the book by the government mandated control, the world state being able to be in order to have the community and identity and stability slogan that they did have. And their control by using soma, the government control they had by using soma as a way to take away any conflict. So pretty much I just applied the aspect of using what was going on during that time period to get a better understanding of what was going through Huxley's head when he wrote the book. Chapter 19, Geography Matters, talks about how pretty much anything can be a plot development or a character or a symbol. And specifically, this chapter talks about how the geography can be a character and be a symbol throughout a book. And Brave New World is set in London, so there's specific significant landmarks and things and monuments that you get to see that are held to a higher standard. So the Big Ben in the book is called the Big Henry, and Westminster Abbey Church is called Westminster Abbey Cabaret, and this is where they hold their solitary services, I believe. And then Ludgate Hill is the church for the new orgy place. So pretty much London is just packed with these big places, these symbolic, significant places, and the Huxley utilizes those in order to make staple places. And looking at geography, I don't know, I normally wouldn't have typically done that, and now I can kind of see what they do hold to a higher standard throughout the novel. Chapter 2, Nice to Eat With You, Foster writes about how food is never simply just food. It's seen as a time of communion and coming together. And in Brave New World, they consume soma, as I mentioned previously. And pretty much this is a time where they all come together, and this is the part where there is that community. Like, they are receiving this together in order to be in the same state of mind. So I never really truly looked that deep into consuming soma. I knew it was a way to mask the conflict and the sadness and the realism of their time, but I didn't realize that as a way of coming together in order for them to be on the same level of numbness. That was all of my applications from Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor to Brave New World. And I really hope you aren't too bored by watching all of these videos or listening to all these videos, and I hope you enjoyed mine. And I just want to thank you for actually assigning a helpful summer reading book like How to Read Literature Like a Professor. I will definitely plan to use Foster's knowledge and apply it to the next books that I read, especially in your class. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.